Welcome to Quantum Photonics. We have a very interesting topic today and very relevant as we have still ongoing COP29. So this talk is about behavior change. Is it essential for reducing greenhouse gas emissions quickly? With a lot of people traveling these days, especially after the pandemic, flying less, eating less meat, driving electric cars, improving home energy efficiency, increased use of public transport, and active travel are some of the most impactful changes that we can make in our daily lives. However, these choices have proved elusive in the general population and are rarely encouraged or modeled by high status individuals. So said Dr. Steve Westlake from Cardiff University, who is our guest speaker, who led this research. So I would like to introduce Dr. Steve Westlake. He is a research fellow at Cardiff University and has worked at the Climate Change Committee, which is the official climate advisors to the UK government. Previously, he has also worked for Shell and for Honda on their top motorcycle racing team. Steve's research explores how leading by example influences the attitudes and behaviors of others and how such kind of leadership can help fight climate change. Underpinning Steve's research is the idea that action is communication. His findings contribute to ongoing debates about individual action versus systems change, highlighting how leaders' actions affect social systems like they are not individual at all. Without further ado, I proudly introduce to you our guest speaker, Dr. Steve Westlake. Steve, welcome to Quantum Photonics.
Hi, Cecile. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we are looking forward to your talk.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, the very kind introduction. And as Cecile says, I'm going to talk about my research into individual behavior change, particularly looking at leaders and leadership. So looking at behavior change from a more stratified perspective. So some people having more influence than others. This is research that I did for my PhD in environmental psychology. And if you're looking at slide number 1, Dr. Christine Dembski and Nick Pidgeon were my supervisors and co-collaborators on this research. And the research has been published in the article in the top right-hand corner. And it was also picked up by the Guardian newspaper, who ran a story on this research. And also towards the end of my presentation, I will talk about another paper that I did with UK members of parliament, UK politicians, and to look at their perspectives on leading by example and individual behavior change. Now, it's quite a contentious area, as you may be aware of, the extent to which individuals should be seen to have responsibility for reducing emissions. Obviously, climate change is a big systemic global problem. Nobody's individual action can make really on its own any difference if you look at it on a very individual basis. And so people have used that to argue against individual behavior change. And indeed, there's evidence that fossil fuel companies have deliberately focused on individuals, put the attention on individuals and saying individuals need to change. And they've done that to try to divert attention away from, for instance, regulations that might limit their ability to extract fossil fuels. So it's a contentious area, and some people argue with some justification that we shouldn't focus on individuals, that we shouldn't put the primary focus on individuals. However, when most people are presented with the facts of climate change, or climate breakdown, as I've slightly modified the title here because I thought I'd make it a little bit more urgent, and we'll look at the urgency in a minute. But when people hear about climate change and climate breakdown, the normal response is, what can I do? What should I be doing? And that response is a very natural human response. And we do all have agency at various levels. My research looks at the agency of individuals, but particularly leaders, people in high status and high prestige positions, and their ability to influence others and potentially influence their behavior. Now, before I dive into the research itself, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how I got here personally. So this is slide number 2. And if we start at the top left-hand corner, we see the Rainbow Warrior, Greenpeace Rainbow Warrior. When I was a teenager, I was in Greenpeace. So I contributed, I paid my subscriptions, and I had the t-shirt, the Rainbow Warrior t-shirt, and I was really concerned about environmental issues, as many young people are, in fact. And there's evidence to show that people are often more connected to environmental issues when they're younger, and then as they progress into their late teens and early 20s, there's a fall off in their concern as other issues become more pressing for them, probably trying to establish themselves in the world, maybe find a partner, find work, and there's a drop off in the early 20s to mid 20s of concern. And perhaps that's what happened to me. So I was in Greenpeace, but then when I graduated from university, I went to work for Shell. Now, I was in the computing department, systems analyst, and that might seem like a strange decision, because even back then, Shell, didn't have a great reputation environmentally. Of course, the picture, I think, depicts the Brent Spar oil platform that Shell was planning to sink at that time, and there was a lot of objections to that because of the environmental damage that it might do. And so even back then, Shell was a company that was deemed problematic. And yet I went to work for them because it was a good job, and I felt like I wanted to earn some money after university. And particularly looking back, there weren't too many pressures on me or social influences on me to suggest that maybe I should do something else, or I should consider that decision. And so the decisions that we make, I'm particularly interested in this idea of social influence, particularly from people with prestige. So after Shell, I went to work on a motorcycle magazine. That's actually me on the front of that magazine, riding bikes, really fun job. And then I went to work in MotoGP for Honda. And that's a race series like Formula One that goes all around the world every year, 16 or 17 races back then, on all 5 continents, or most of the continents. So very high carbon footprint. And I remember when I took that job, I was sitting at my kitchen table and I thought, this job is going to have a massive carbon footprint. Is it really what I want to do? Is it really what I should do? But I did. I thought, okay, well, someone's going to do this job. Why not me? And again, I didn't have many influences saying, are you sure about this? I didn't have any social pressure, let's say, not to do it. So I did that job. And then I did that for a few years, and then started working for magazines again, a cycling magazine, which perhaps arguably a little bit more environmentally friendly, although in fact it's still a magazine that promotes consumption and lots of travel, and isn't necessarily super green as a job. And then after that, I started getting much more into climate change again. Worked for the Climate Change Committee. So I did a master's in climate change, got a job at the Climate Change Committee in their communications team. And the Climate Change Committee is at the heart of UK climate policy making. So that was a great job to learn about policy and the politics of climate change. And then the top right, that's I was in Oxford Circus when Extinction Rebellion began their activities in 2018, and I was arrested around the pink boat. I don't know if you remember, they parked a pink boat in Oxford Circus and blocked lots of roads. And that really pushed climate change up the agenda, certainly in the UK and perhaps around the world as well, or bits of the world. So it's been a bit of a journey for me. I then went to do a PhD at Cardiff University, and that's what I'm doing now, or rather, I finished that, but I'm doing this research. So throughout all this trajectory, there's been more or less influence on me, acting individually, acting collectively, and it's that social influence that I'm particularly interested in. And just to say, I realize the audience for this talk is potentially quite international. I'm going to talk from a pretty global north-centric point of view, and quite UK-centric sometimes as well. So that's accepting that this is only a small microcosm of climate action. However, obviously, in terms of carbon footprints, it's the global north which has the lion's share and perhaps the biggest responsibility to reduce emissions. So we'll come on to that. So I'm just going to talk a bit about leadership. This is David Attenborough speaking at COP24. So we're on to slide number 3. And he's saying, leaders of the world, you must lead. The continuation of civilizations and the natural world upon which we depend is in your hands. So he's putting a lot of responsibility on leaders there. And leadership is a contested concept, really. But Attenborough there is going along with this idea that leaders have the power, and they have the power to make change, and also they have the responsibility to make change. And so the questions I ask is, in the context of climate change, do they have a responsibility to change their own behavior as well as usher in systemic changes? So just looking to the problem itself, as we see on the left here, it's just a recap of the emissions curve. So greenhouse gas emissions, it says CO2 emissions actually in gigatons, climbing and climbing. And then we see the steep curves that those emissions need to follow, the plummeting emissions that need to happen if we're to keep within the 1.5 degree threshold. And indeed, that threshold may be passed this year. We may hit 1.5 already. So we can see that the emissions may be tailing off a little bit, but in terms of the speed that they need to fall, we're nowhere near. We're nowhere near that. And a recent news story on the right, 2024 is almost certain to be the hottest year on record. And obviously, as Cecile said, COP29 is happening at the moment, and these discussions are ongoing. And obviously, we've seen a huge amount of effects of climate extremes around the world, and those are worsened by climate change, and that's scientifically proven. So heat waves, droughts, wildfires, floods. In Europe, we saw really dramatic and terrible flooding in Spain recently, and indeed we saw some political unrest as people protested at the insufficient reactions to that from governments. So there's a real urgency here. And the question of individual behavior is one that isn't going to go away. So this graph shows different carbon footprints. So average per capita carbon emissions for the 1%, top 1% of earners, top 10%, middle 40%, and the bottom 50%. And I've put the big arrows there to show where, for a 1.5 degree world, by 2030, so that's only 6 years' time, the average emissions need to be 2.1 tons of CO2 per person. And obviously, if you compare that to the two left-hand bars, we're a long way off. So these ideas of who should change and whether we should focus on individual emissions need to be considered in the context of these vast disparities between average per capita carbon emissions. So it's not the bottom 50%, maybe not even the middle 40% that we need to focus on. It's the top 1% and the top 10%. And that is where probably most of us in this talk, and maybe perhaps many listening to the talk, that's where we reside. So this question of who needs to change and whether we should focus on individual emissions is perhaps not useful to consider. On average, we need to look at who is doing the most emitting and how much choice and agency and indeed power they have to change that. So I'm just going to put up this image. This is, some of you may have seen this. It was a tracker. It's actually a video from YouTube of Taylor Swift's private jets in 2023 and where they went. It's quite entertaining. 2 minutes, you see from no flights, the North American continent fills up with private jet flights. There's 2 private jets of Taylor Swift, and then there's a bit where it bobs up and down to South America as well. And it got quite a lot of attention, and Taylor Swift's climate impact became a point of discussion. Now, obviously, Taylor Swift, somebody with huge potential impact on in terms of influence on her fans, and a cultural leader. So in my research, I look at politicians, I look at business leaders, and I also look at celebrities because of their role in potentially steering society as well. So again, 2 more leaders here. We've got Bill Gates saying that he's part of the solution. So Bill Gates is quite well known for having, I think he's described it himself as a private jet habit. I think he called it his, I don't know if he said it was his dirty little secret or something, but he's well known to like private jets, and also defends that use of private jets as well. He's part of the solution. He's funding climate programs, etc. On the bottom, there's the former UK Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, taking helicopter trips that would have taken just over an hour by train. So apparently there's an alternative to that choice, but he's chosen helicopter trips for various reasons. And on the right, this is, I put here, this is somebody looking at this leadership behavior, and the questions essentially that they might ask are, when I see leaders doing this, why should I change my own behavior? So we're often told or informed that we will need to change our behavior. Science definitely says that behavior change will be part of the solution. So some of the things that Cecile mentioned at the beginning, so potentially flying less, eating less meat, improving home energy efficiency, active travel, etc. But when we see leaders not acting in that way, why should we change our own behavior? Also, we might ask ourselves, are the leaders credible on climate change? So do they really think it's serious? Can they really believe it's serious, as they tell us, if they make these choices? So these are the kind of questions that I explore in my research. And also, does it matter if leaders behave like this? So this is just one more, and going into a little bit more detail. So this was a story about, in the UK, the Prime Minister, a former Prime Minister who was the Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, and King Charles each took their own private jets to travel to COP28. So this was last year. They each took different private jets, and that was criticised by some in the media because of the signals it might send. And the response from government in the UK was, this government's approach to tackling climate change is not about banning or reducing people from flying. It is through investing in new technologies of the future. And this might be a familiar retort to people who suggest we do need behavior change. Certainly, it's a very common political response, is that we won't talk about behavior change, or at least we won't apply any pressure for people to change their behavior, or indeed any imperative for them to do so. We'll talk about new technology. And that's appealing politically because of various ideas of growth and innovation and progress But according to the science and the speed with which we need to decarbonize, it's not realistic to just talk about technology, although technology will, of course, be very necessary. And I'm just going to talk about a few more pieces of context. So this was Margaret Thatcher, UK Prime Minister in 1990, putting out a slightly different message. So she says the danger of global warming is as yet unseen. That was back in 1990. We're seeing it now. But real enough for us to make changes and sacrifices so that we do not live at the expense of future generations. And then she says, our ability to come together to stop or limit damage to the world's environment will be perhaps the greatest test of how far we can act as a world community. So the narratives there are of responsibility, a moral imperative to make changes and sacrifices, and intergenerational equity. So we mustn't live at the expense of future generations. So that's some quite bold statements there from Margaret Thatcher, and perhaps statements that are easy to make in the abstract. And now I'm going to put up another quote from a world leader, which paints a slightly different picture. Shortly after, 2 years later, George H.W. Bush said the American way of life is not up for negotiation. So really, not really buying into Thatcher's call for changes and sacrifices. And obviously, this word sacrifice is quite contentious in climate discourse. And the prevailing sense now is that we mustn't be calling for people to make sacrifices because it's politically too problematic. And this sums it up really. So Boris Johnson says for years, Boris Johnson, former UK Prime Minister, there's been a lot of those recently. For years, going green was inextricably bound up with a sense that we have to sacrifice the things we love. But he says we can build back greener without so much as a hair shirt in sight. And he says we'll be driving electric cars, flying in planes, and it will all be guilt free. And so this idea of guilt, sacrifice and guilt, both have moral connotations. What do we value? What do we not value? Should we feel any sort of guilt or responsibility, or should we not? And those themes I will come back to a little bit later as I present the findings from my research. And morality is actually laced through the climate change debate, even if it's not explicitly expressed. And in fact, I would argue that morality is the battleground of climate action. Who has responsibility, a moral responsibility to act, and who doesn't? So just one more politician. This was another UK politician, Ed Miliband, and he was advocating for an electric car revolution. So this is just to illustrate how perhaps difficult it is for politicians when they are talking about even future technology. So he was saying we need an electric car revolution. We need to make it much easier for people to get electric cars. He talked for about 3 minutes about how good electric cars are and how positive it will be for society. And the interviewers, perhaps predictably, said, I presume you've got an electric car, to which Miliband said, I haven't yet, it's a work in progress. And the interviewers threw up their hands and said, what? Practice what you preach, lead by example, all these phrases. And in fact, what the following segment in this interview was actually quite a sophisticated discussion of leadership, where ideas that leaders should go first, they should prove the ground, they should set a direction of travel. All these ideas of leadership were contained in this interview, and it wasn't, even though it appeared to be a gotcha, it was actually quite a sophisticated discussion in essence about what leadership is and what leaders should do. So going first. So coming to my paper. Now it gets a little bit more techie, and I'll try not to make it too scientific and techie because it's it's half past 4 in the evening here in the UK, but I'll try and keep it fairly top level. But this is the paper and the hypotheses that I wanted to test in the context that I've set out were that leading by example with high impact low carbon behavior, so high impact means it has a big effect on your carbon footprint, so changes that really lower your carbon footprint. So my hypotheses are that that kind of behavior from leaders increases observers' willingness to act. In other words, people who see that kind of behavior are more willing to act themselves, more willing to adopt those behaviors that I put in brackets there. Also, this kind of leading by example increases observers' positive appraisals of the leader. In other words, the leaders appear better in the eyes of people who see that kind of behavior. Appraisals are improved, and it also changes people's perceptions of climate change, including the risk perception. So in other words, I wanted to test this idea that the way leaders act might change how much someone thinks climate change is actually a big problem. So it's going back to that question of how serious is climate change if we see our leaders taking perhaps unnecessary private jet flights? Does it actually send a signal that climate change isn't that serious? And I'll just talk about how we did this study briefly. So it was an experiment in essence, and we had 5 conditions. So we had conditions where the leader was leading by example and conditions where they weren't leading by example. And we also had a politician and a celebrity doing both of those things. And then we had a condition that didn't have a leader in them. So there were 5 conditions, and participants in the survey were allocated to one of those 5 conditions. So they only went to one, and they either saw a politician leading by example or a politician not leading by example, similarly a celebrity leading by example or not. They only saw one. And then we asked them a series of questions about their own perceptions of the leader and of climate change in general. So we had 250 people in each of those conditions. We used an online platform that's very common in research, and it was a representative sample in the UK. And the results, we found that leading by example, so those people who saw a leader who was leading by example said they were more willing to change their own behavior. So just the signal that the leader is doing it made people say they were more willing to change their own behavior than people who saw a leader who wasn't leading by example. Now, it was a small difference. It was statistically significant. So we can say that it didn't just happen by chance. But we argue or suggest within the paper that this effect could be bigger if it was a real example of leading by example. So this was an experiment in a survey form, in a survey context. If it was a real leader, the effects could be bigger because it would have a stronger signaling effect. Also, we suggest that if it was multiple leaders, so not just one leader, because it might be quite easy to dismiss one leader, but if it was multiple leaders leading by example, then perhaps the effect would be bigger. Just to say, I'm up to slide 16 now, if anybody is wanting to catch up and see where I am. And we'll move on to slide 17. So this was, just to reiterate, it was a small effect on willingness to act, but a significant one. But in terms of the perceptions of the leaders, so how did people perceive leaders who were leading by example or not leading by example? And the perceptions were really very different. So the green bars here are if leaders were leading by example. And you can see that people thought those leaders care about climate change and believe it's more serious to a much greater extent. And in fact, they thought that the leaders who weren't leading by example, in effect, they didn't really care about it, and they didn't believe climate change was serious. Similarly, there's a sizable effect on how knowledgeable the leader is seen to be. Leaders who lead by example were seen to be more knowledgeable, which is interesting because within our experiment there was no difference in the knowledgeability of the leaders. We didn't have one appearing to be extremely knowledgeable and very technical and the other not. Both of them had expressed the same amount of knowledge, but those that were leading by example were perceived to be more knowledgeable. They were also perceived to be more trustworthy, more effective. The reactance against them was less. I'll talk about reactance a bit more later. And the leaders who were leading by example were approved of more. And indeed, some of those scores you can see are negative. So there's negative approval, negative perceptions of trustworthiness for the leaders who were not leading by example. So we suggest that these perceptions could be really important, because if leaders, say politicians or business leaders, are bringing in policies that will affect people's lives, then they need to be perceived as trustworthy and credible and caring about these issues. And if they're not perceived in that way, it could harm their ability to bring in the social changes that are necessary to tackle the climate crisis. So moving on to slide 18. Now I'll rattle through this. This is a little bit of bonus content, actually. It's not in the paper that we published, but it was some extra analysis we did on the data. And I talked about risk perception. So we also asked people how much they perceived climate change as a risk. We asked them how much they support climate action. That's the bottom left graph. We asked people how responsible they felt for addressing climate change and taking personal action. We asked people how much they thought other people were willing to change their own behavior. So do you think other people will change their behavior? Each of those on the left-hand side wasn't statistically significantly different. So we can't say, yes, leading by example affects the things on the left-hand side. However, when we combined them together, they did become slightly significant, statistically significant, this idea of total influence. So we're not making strong claims about this. It certainly needs more research, but there could be a deeper effect on people's perceptions of climate change if leaders are seen to be leading by example or not. And in the real world, you could imagine this. If leaders in general, if many politicians from across the political spectrum started to change their own behavior and talk about it, you could imagine that having an effect on other people's perceptions of climate change as an issue in general. And it was the same trend, just one more thing we tested was people's pro-environmental identity. Now, pro-environmental identity essentially means how much do you identify with environmental issues? And it's a very strong predictor of people's willingness to change and people's tendency to adopt pro-environmental behaviors if they identify as somebody who is pro-environmental, perhaps unsurprisingly. And we found a similar trend, again, non-significant, but a similar trend that people who were exposed to somebody leading by example said their pro-environmental identity was greater. Now, this taps into a key part of leadership, according to leadership psychology, is the ability to tap into people's identities. Obviously, political leaders do this a great deal. Even business leaders do this, and celebrities, cultural leaders, they tap into people's identity and they can shape and change identities as well, depending on the leadership signals. So if leaders were to send signals that climate change, environmental action is a really important thing to take on, you can imagine that changing people's pro-environmental identity, or at least heightening it, making it more salient. So we also asked people about their appetite for leadership. Now, apologies for the multiple arrows on slide 20. When I present this, usually I have one arrow at a time, but you're getting all the arrows at one time. So we'll just talk about a few of these results. Essentially, people want leadership. People want to see leaders leading by example, according to our research. If we look at the top answer, so we asked people whether they agreed that politicians, business leaders, and celebrities should set an example by making lifestyle changes first. And you can see that 86% of people agreed with that, and very few, 4%, didn't agree with it. So people think leaders should act first. If we go down to the third one, no, if we go down to the fourth one, people with the biggest carbon footprint should make the biggest lifestyle changes to tackle climate change. So a similar result there. It's saying, yeah, leaders have most responsibility because they've got biggest carbon footprints. They should make the biggest changes to tackle climate change. And then the final two, the bottom two answers, we asked people how much they think they could be affected by such leadership. So if leaders went first, the second to last answer, if leaders went first, I would be more willing to change my lifestyle to tackle climate change. More than half of people said yes, that's the case. Only 20% said no, they didn't think they could be influenced. Now, often we think we can't be influenced by people. We think we're acting individually, we make rational decisions. Psychological research suggests that's not quite the case. We're very influenced by what other people do. And the bottom answer, if I knew that most other people were changing their lifestyles because of climate change, I would be more willing to change mine too. So over 60%, 64% of people said if they thought everybody else was doing it, they would be more willing to do it. So this idea of collective effort, and this is evidenced by other research. There's been a big survey recently saying that people, they're kind of unaware of the willingness of other people to do it, and that's a real brake, a real drag on climate action. So if we think other people are going to do it, we're more willing to do it ourselves because it's fairer, you're part of a collective effort. And we argue that leaders, visible leaders, have quite a responsibility to signal this collective effort to make behavior changes. So imagine if Taylor Swift did make behavior changes because of climate change and said, I'm going to modify the amount I fly, I'll take fewer private jet flights and encourage my fans to do that. You can imagine that could have quite an effect. So in terms of hypotheses, we'll just quickly summarize these. We found that low carbon behavior from leaders does increase people's willingness to act, observers' willingness to act. It does increase positive appraisals of leaders, and maybe it affects perceptions of climate change, but we don't have definite data for that. But we argue that leading by example is a crucial missing link in climate change mitigation. I'm going to skip the limitations because they're a bit dull. It was a survey experiment, so it's not the real world. However, we feel that there are implications for the real world. Just going to talk briefly about the other paper. Now, this was with politicians in the UK, and I interviewed them and asked them whether they thought they could lead by example. Obviously, it might not be easy for leaders to do this, even though it's quite easy to say, oh, leaders should lead by example. In practice, there are all kinds of limitations for them, and particularly for politicians, one could argue. So I interviewed politicians in the UK, and one of the things they said, and we'll talk about this, the headline I chose was that we can't be too saintly, i.e. they can't be seen to be too virtuous because they will incur negative reactions. So what they said, this is a very brief summary, but they said in principle they want to lead by example, and one of the politicians cited Mahatma Gandhi saying, be the change that you want to see in the world. That's how I see things. I asked them if they thought they were role models. One answered, absolutely, I do feel the lack of morality in politics at the moment. I mean just having self-restraint and self-decency. And those ideas of self-restraint and self-decency are perhaps across the board, but they also particularly interesting for people on the right of politics, this idea of self-restraint, self-regulation, discipline. These are ideas which appeal to those on the right of politics, or it has been argued that much, for instance, by George Lakoff. So this idea of regulating your own behavior, even though people on the right of politics generally are less in favor of climate action on aggregate, changing behavior and having self-regulation may appeal to them. So there seems to be perhaps a little bit of tension there. I talked about morality, so I'm just going to talk about morality again. Virtue signaling comes quite a lot when you talk about low carbon behavior, pro-environmental behavior. And one of the MPs, one of the politicians said, in fact, the virtue signaling is part of the problem. Look at me, I'm so green. So this idea that if you display pro-environmental behavior or pro-social behavior more generally, then it's a negative thing. It's almost a moral negative for the kind of reasons that you're trying to appear too virtuous and maybe you're not sincere. And this taps into this idea, or rather this proven idea, that we often dismiss other people's behavior when it appears to be virtuous because it might threaten our moral self-image. So we don't want to feel as though we're not doing the right thing. Therefore, we denigrate. It's called do-gooder denigration in the literature. We denigrate what other people are doing so that we can remain feeling like good people. And so the ways we might do that are by saying, they're not motivated by good reasons, they're motivated by trying to look good. They want to make themselves look good, which is actually seen as a moral negative. Or we can denigrate it by saying it's not going to work, that there's no point. And that's another argument that's used against individual behavior. There's no point, it makes no difference. Therefore, we can dismiss the behavior as pointless. And so just coming back to some of the quotes on morality. So one MP said, I try to set some sort of example, but not be too saintly. So this idea of doing good things, but not being too goody-goody. Another MP said, I think the climate change movement, they asked people to become almost like Trappist monks. So another morally laden religious connotations about doing good things and how that's not necessarily viewed positively. And then this MP saying, you take people with you on a journey of changing. I think that's a better role than being out there, being absolutely fabulous and perfect. So this idea of purity and perfection and how that's unattainable, and we shouldn't make that an aspiration. And also, just to wrap up soon, there was this idea, what cropped up quite a lot in the interviews was an extreme case formulation. So this is a way of using language which uses an extreme case to argue against a more moderate case. So for instance, this MP says on slide 27, getting rid of all flights is not realistic, but we've got to look towards a world where we can somehow make air flight not environmentally damaging, and that's difficult. So they've put up this argument that we're getting rid of all flights, we can't get rid of all flights. And that obviously is an extreme case and suggests that somebody is saying we should get rid of all flights, as opposed to suggesting some people might fly less. So you make an extreme case and then you argue against the more moderate case with that extreme case. Also, we see there the shift to technology, making air flights not environmentally damaging is the solution. And then the second quote, I wouldn't be going out there saying, yes, I'm going to be green and nobody should buy a car ever again. So this extreme case of nobody buying a car ever again, I don't think anyone's actually suggesting that. But that kind of rhetoric, this extreme case formulation is used to argue against any kind of behavior change or any kind of advocacy for behavior change. Also, perhaps a commonly understood and well seen rhetoric is that of incrementalism. So this MP said, probably the way forward is asking people to take baby steps. This is in terms of behavior change. And the second MP, this on slide 28, said, there are plenty of things you can do as an individual that can make little changes that if everybody did it, that becomes a real game changer. So this idea of every little helps, we just do small things and it'll add up. And it's an idea that's really appealing and does seem to set a pathway forward, but is also identified as being insufficient. We need to make big changes, the really things that make a big difference, not the small, easy things, unfortunately. Which is obviously, as a politician, it's hard to argue that. And politicians have been shown to avoid grappling with these difficult parts of addressing climate change. And so there's research on UK politicians again, which says they tame climate change. So they use economic language, not language that applies to people. So in effect, they downplay the problem because they feel that it's going to scare off or put off constituents. So just to summarize, incrementalism isn't going to achieve the rapid emissions reductions that we need to see as per this graph, and isn't going to avert the rapid increases in temperatures. So I put forward some final questions. Maybe we want to discuss these or others. So final questions are leaders doing enough? Are they doing the right things? Is leading by example necessary, or is it going to work? I'd be interested in what people think. And perhaps more provocatively, can the current economic system and imperatives avert climate breakdown? So that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that was interesting in some ways, and feel free to ask any questions or give any feedback or push back against anything I've said. Thank you very much.
Hi,
Yeah, thank you
Steve.
so much, Steve. Just a minute, Mark. Thank you so much. So we are informing the audience that we are opening the floor for questions or any reactions. Please feel free to raise your hand, and we will bring you up the stage. And Steve, thank you for making this great presentation with your slides. So, I just want to ask you, Mark, I will let you speak in a while. I will just ask some question to Steve. So, you are referring based on your study about the reactions of people based upon the leaders' actions in the UK. So, do you believe that the impact of leading by example varies across different cultures or countries?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't have definite answers on it. So I've got some theoretical arguments to make about that, but I think the cultural differences could be really important and certainly ones to consider. So, for instance, I'd be really interested in doing the study in the United States, which is obviously, well, I say obviously, in the UK, we've had a reasonable consensus, political consensus on climate change. And that's beginning to break down, but we've had a good consensus. And so it may be that more people are going to respond positively to leading by example. I can imagine, for instance, in the United States, it would be quite different. But really, perhaps that comes down to the position of the leaders themselves. So it's not necessarily that leading by example wouldn't be effective. It's more that it's perhaps much less likely from some parts of leadership in the US. How that would pan out in cultures where there is already more of a collective or a communal and collective culture anyway. I wouldn't like to say. I could make some guesses, but theoretically, I think just to say that underpinning the research is this theory that we have probably evolved to pay special attention to leaders and what they do. So leadership, in terms of individual leadership, people having higher status and prestige and being followed, is shown to happen in all cultures or most cultures. And there are theories that suggest we've evolved to pay extra attention. So perhaps following leaders who had particular skills or particular knowledge helped to survive because they were better at surviving. So if we followed them and followed what they did, we would survive too. So if we do, as a species have this tendency to look towards people with knowledge and prestige, then the influence of leader behavior may be in some ways universal. Now, obviously, it's going to interact with cultures and politics and social systems, so it's going to be highly complex. But I would suggest there is some reason to believe that the behavior of leaders, yes, would have effects in other countries as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think there is such concept in trying to influence public policy and also actual movement of people as somebody who is supposed to be called a servant leader, which has been a
Mm,
concept for quite a while. And
yeah.
on the other hand, this is my opinion. I think, a leader should have a moral ascendancy if you try to preach something which is trying to call for action. You should also show that you are practicing it. And I would just like to give an example. This is not about climate change, but the kind of leadership in general that they do in Japan, for instance. Uh, People tend to obey the leaders. For example, if the leader will say we should save at least 1 teaspoon of sugar per day. And so, yeah, people will try to follow it. And in the end, the kind of effect that they have by saving only that is already big because they act just like a collective. So, yeah, I think that's it. And even when you do some military actions, or even if you go to war in general, it is important for people to be able to follow the leaders. So, in terms of tactics, I think this is something to think about. And yeah, I think the examples and the anecdotes that you gave, even in your paper, are also very important to look at. So yeah, that's just my comment. So
Mm.
yeah, we have Kevin here on stage, and Mark was going to speak a while ago. So Mark, I'd like to give you the mic.
Thank you, Cecile, Steve. Great presentation. I've also been preoccupied with the climate since I was young. I think I got a few years on you, but I have a finance background, and I see what today the message is not uh, getting across to the leaders because they they don't have this financial benefit. And what I see needs to change are the generally accepted accounting principles. uh, they need to include circular acts by companies and individuals to generate benefits for the world. Today, uh, the for profit public companies will do nothing to prevent climate change because it goes against their uh, stockholder. They need to benefit the stockholders. So this is one thing, and then there are also messages that I believe need to be more focused on man-made pollution as opposed to weather conditions, because I mean, as far as I know, everywhere around the world, the weathermen are wrong a lot of the time. So um, I don't want to. I could go on for a long time, but I think those are two uh, very critical points that if that happens, then the change that we're all seeking could happen. What do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I certainly agree that the incentives aren't there for corporations to act in ways that are good for the environment, and the profit motive of um, big corporations, particularly the fossil fuel industry, has put a drag on climate action for decades. There's evidence. There's evidence of that, and yeah, for as long as the assets and the projected profits rely on yeah, assets based on fossil fuel extraction, then it's going to be very difficult for that to change. So for sure, and just to say, I don't think I said this in my presentation, but I certainly don't believe behavior change, individualizing climate is in any way the only solution, or indeed the biggest solution. I just think it could be transformative in a mindset, in terms of a mindset shift. And if leaders themselves were acting it out, that in itself would shift their mindsets, or indicate a shift of mindset that would make, for instance, the regulations that are necessary, would make those regulations more likely, because leaders, because there's an effect of, in some ways, you do what you think. When you think something, your attitudes and your values, you respond to your attitudes and your values and your thoughts, and you act accordingly. There's evidence of that, but also you align your attitudes and your values with what you do. And so there's a chicken and egg element. So if leaders are acting it out, then they're likely to be more serious about the solutions. Your second point, in terms of whether men being wrong or whether people being wrong, I mean, I'm not sure. Obviously, weather is very difficult to predict with any great accuracy. Climate change is less difficult to predict, and in fact, is the predictions based on models have been right. It's in essence, not in the fine detail, but in terms of the trajectory, the increased extreme weathers, increases of extreme weather, and things are happening in fact faster than the climate scientists predicted in terms of climate breakdown, if you want to call it that. So yeah, I think weather and climate are different, and it's important to be aware of that.
So I understand this these models. I I I again, the oceans are full of plastic. The yes, the temperatures of the oceans are rising. Uh, the one thing that I don't see, and there is no observations other than small volcanic islands of any sea levels in any major city rising. Alexandria has been thousands of years there. Venice, I mean, you could name cities all over the world. Uh, so what if the ocean floor is dropping? Um, the, you know, I, I, I think we need to focus on what the industrialized uh, world has contributed to causing these extreme disasters and the extreme weather conditions. I've seen attempts to do cloud seeding to reflect the sunlight in an attempt to cool the earth. I don't think this is a good idea, and it's been going on for a while. And uh, maybe this is causing the floods. And the thing about technology, this answer, I like sustainable aviation fuel as a substitute, but trees and replenishing coral reefs and algae growth, these things, the Mother Nature uh, is the best technology ever created, uh, ever. I think man can help it, but uh, I think we gotta work and help Mother Nature repair itself. And I don't
Mark,
know about technology doing it.
thank you, Mark. Kevin, do you have a question for our wonderful speaker?
Oh yeah, yeah. This is great. Yeah, I've studied this a lot, pretty much. But yeah, thought of some things. Basically, if if you're an influencer or politician, even doesn't matter if you're left or right, you still want votes. You still so basically, an agent may tell you, this could be bad PR, bad publicity. If you push this too much, you'll be like a sore thumb sticking out. So that's part of it, probably. And also, I think that cuts to the chase right there. You follow the money, basically, uh, for power and economics, and also I think in the future, really near future, with quantum computers, with weather simulations and such, it's pretty simple once you break it down, the factors. So especially to a quantum computer and AI and everything. So I think there'll be not much more debate, you know, coming up here soon, of this. So it'll be more on the agenda, and also, as you said, conservatives, and especially in America, the agenda is not big for climate mitigation right now, and also it'll take some momentum. If someone's gonna stick out like a sore thumb, the only one doing this, then it'll have to be like a domino effect. Have to gain some momentum. So, and I think we're on a gradual change. We're gradually changing. It's like a movie. We're stuck in a moment, but we're gradually changing. It's not like we're gonna be on primitive fossil fuels forever. You know, so tech, and so yeah. So there's some of the things I thought of.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Can I come back on that? Yeah, I think yeah, I agree with some of the points you've made. I think the sticking out like a sore thumb point in terms of people not wanting to go first for fear of being judged is definitely true. And it's so one of the kind of theories and the evidence I'm trying to provide is that, first of all, that it could be more popular than people think. So some of the research that I've done, I did some focus groups with people presenting leaders who were taking action, and generally, even if there was a slightly negative or cynical reaction initially, people did come around and consider the action and approved of it more than they disapproved. Um, so the image that's portrayed in the media is not necessarily the universal reaction, although the media is really important. And I think the second and related point is that there is actually a lot of work that goes into maintaining the status quo. So, for instance, I put up that quote from George H.W. Bush: "The American way of life is not up for negotiation." There's a lot of work that goes into maintaining that in terms of, and not just in the States. The idea that we shouldn't be asked to change behavior, we shouldn't be asked to consider reducing consumption, because there are all sorts of economic imperatives and norms that suggest that we need growth and we need increasing and ever more consumption, and that freedom and a good life is dependent on high consumption and extreme mobility, etc. And challenging those type of economic and social norms is really difficult. So there's a lot of pressure working against this idea, but then there's also perhaps an increasing awareness, I believe, and I've spoken to some business leaders who are, for instance, they're high wealth, C-suite, kind of executive suite people, but they're kind of aware that there's a big contradiction between the statements that their companies make on the need for a really rapid climate transition and their own behavior, both kind of individually and collectively as elites or as wealthy individuals. I think there's an increasing awareness that it doesn't quite match up. There's a bit of a contradiction there, and so I guess my hope is that that awareness will lead to changes, and there could even be tipping points where the social norms tip quite quickly away from just the unlimited um, kind of unlimited consumption and the celebration of excessive consumption. But I suppose that's an optimistic take, um, and hopefully I'm trying to provide evidence that is possible.
All right. I think on my PTR, Sasha is next. Do you have a question or a comment for us?
Hi, thank you for letting me up. I don't, I mean, I'm just interested in listening for the time being. My position uh, is something I've been following for about 10 years. Um, and I used to say, just have the conventional view. Over the last 10 years or so, I've become increasingly skeptical of a lot of the alarmist claims that are made about this, but I don't really want to go into that. I'm just interested in listening to the opinions of everybody else for the time being, and unfortunately, I can't because I'm driving. I can't listen unless I'm up on the stage. So I hope it's okay with them.
We are indeed. Welcome to the stage and enjoy your listening. And I'd like to pass the mic to Ash.
Hello, hello. Hi, everyone. Steve, thank you for the presentation. Um, I I tend to think that some of the problem is, it's a deep problem. I feel like it's like an externality that needs to be internalized in terms of economic terms. But also, like you were saying, there's like a misalignment between personal, organizational behavior and what people, like you were saying, project out or image. Do you think that the solution is somehow in having those alignments?
Sorry for the pause. Yeah, I mean, I think the alignment is really important, and it comes down to the theories underpinning my research are that in essence we're social creatures. We've evolved to pay a great deal of attention to what other people do, and that behavior of other people carries a lot of meaning about what those people believe, what we believe collectively, what we value. And so if we are, and this is my kind of argument about the situation we're in now, and I think I mentioned this earlier, but if leaders are saying this is an urgent problem, well, some leaders are saying this is an urgent problem, this requires deep systemic changes, it requires, I mean, according to the climate scientists have said, it requires real realignments of our economic systems. And if the politicians are saying they agree with this, science-based targets as are being discussed in COP29, but their behaviors, their kind of elective behaviors, appear to contradict it, then that carries meaning for people who observe them. So there's this idea that leadership is a kind of disembodied at the moment. So leadership is something which is technical and technocratic and intellectual and cognitive, and yet there's an embodied side of leadership as well, which carries a lot of meaning for us. And my contention is that there is a contradiction between how leaders are embodying the climate crisis and what they're saying about it. Now, obviously, there's a great deal of important detail about what embodiment might mean, because you can argue that world leaders, politicians, negotiators, business leaders even need to have high carbon lifestyles in some senses. So they need to be going to, COP29 and having these negotiations, or doing other leadership roles. But at the moment, there's also behavior and norms which are greatly in excess of what might be said to be necessary, and those are defended and claimed to be unimportant. My contention is that they potentially are very important to whether we will achieve these societal shifts. So yeah, I think there's an externality. So obviously there's an external. You mentioned externalities, Ash. There's an externality in terms of how we deal with climate or environmental issues in an economic sense. The costs of environmental damage, be it pollution or other kinds of degradation, those costs aren't factored into cost benefit analysis, for instance. But also there's kind of an externality of our own actions and our own consumption. And we, in effect, externalize the damage of those as well. And so, yeah, I would argue that those need to be internalized, and that leaders have an important role to play in that internalization.
And maybe hence it's almost like a cultural change, a cultural evolution of sorts, and maybe it takes a little longer.
Yeah, I agree. A cultural evolution for sure, and in terms of the speed with which that can happen, I mean, I think it could be rapid, but it would require um, strong, courageous leadership, and it would require a kind of an assuming of responsibility, a taking on of responsibility, which isn't happening now.
Yes, Steve. So, I understand you are advising to the UK government. Um, can you tell us about some challenges or important experiences so far that you had done on this advocacy?
Yeah, sure. So I don't advise the government now. So I did work for the Climate Change Committee, which are the official advisors to government. I stopped that job to go and do the PhD. So I don't, yeah, I don't advise government now. I mean, I think the UK government obviously has just changed, and the new government appears much more committed to climate action, but still treading a tightrope or sitting on the fence in terms of the extent to which fossil fuels need to be eliminated from the economy. And that's the bottom line, really, is that we need to stop fossil fuel use. I mean, it's not even in COP29, sorry, in COP UNFCCC documents, fossil fuels, I believe, still aren't mentioned as the cause of climate change, which is an extraordinary state of affairs. And the UK government is also not being I mean, it's put a stop on new oil licenses, new oil and gas licenses, but isn't trying to wind down current ones at any great speed. So there's definitely, and the UK, there's a lot of contention about the UK is put up as a climate leader and certainly claims to be a climate leader as well. But there are some strong arguments to suggest that the UK's climate targets aren't commensurate with, they don't fit with a Paris Agreement in terms of equity and historic emissions. So yeah, I don't. I mean, I don't advise climate government. I don't advise the UK government now, but there there's still a lot of work to be done there.
Yeah, thank you. So, I think Mark was writing something at the room chat. Would you like to speak, Mark?
Yes, Cecile, thank you. So you're focused on leaders, Steve, and um, the 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 leaders of today. Uh, count them on your fingers. Some good ones. I don't know any right now, in any country. Maybe the Korean. I like the Korean PM. He takes commercial flights. Doesn't do first class. Um, but I'll, see, I think the problem is way above government levels, because the multinationals are controlling government uh, laws. Um, the one country, and where I live, Brazil, has mandated car manufacturers for over 40 years to produce flex engines, which run on 100% ethanol and gasoline. So uh, I choose ethanol. Is it the best solution? It's a very good solution if everybody in the world, and all the manufacturers. So you have here in Brazil, you have Asian manufacturers, you have European manufacturers, American, North American manufacturers. So all of them have the technology to produce 100% ethanol. Uh, Flex, uh, to run on 100% ethanol cars, yet the countries that in Europe are fiddling around with 15%. You know, it's why hasn't this? This is another solution that has been forgotten. Um, so there are good ideas that are examples in the world that haven't been adopted. And Cecile mentioned Japan. I love the Japanese culture here, and wherever they go in the Olympic Games, they stay back after the game. The everybody leaves and they clean up the stadium. This is community. This is what communities uh, really should be like. Everybody looking out for the next, your neighbor. But uh, like I said again, the profit motive keeps us focused on economics, and the gap principles. If we change those, I think then we can uh, get to where we want to go. That is the key.
Thanks a lot, Mark. I wanted to get a response from our speaker.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark. I didn't know that about the Korean Prime Minister actually, so I'm going to look that up. That's a really good tip in terms of leadership, and I think you know, when you put it in the context of the economic model generally globally working against climate change mitigation from in the sense of the profit motive. I mean, I'm not an economist, and obviously there are a lot of people who say that if the incentives were right and the regulations are right, then we can have a transition to a greener future. I don't know if I don't know the ins and outs of that. Um, and as you say, there are a lot of perverse incentives and solutions which aren't adopted. Um, but yeah, I will take your point on the Korean prime minister as an example. And if signals like that were more widespread, then perhaps that could be a vehicle for change.
Yes, so we've been here for an hour and 30 minutes, and I would like to ask our speaker, Steve, how much more time do you have for us?
Yeah, thanks, Cecile. I've got another 15 minutes or so before I have to go.
Yeah, thank you. So I'd like to ask other members of the audience if they have some additional questions. Please raise your hand and go up the stage. This is an opportunity to ask our speaker some questions on his presentation. So, yeah, I want to ask you also, Steve, what do you think are the challenges that high status individuals face when trying to adopt and promote low carbon lifestyles?
Yeah, thanks, Cecile. I think it's a really good question, a really important question, and it's really not easy. And it is easy to say our leaders should be different, and almost as David Attenborough said, sort of stack a whole load of responsibility on leaders, and especially, I mean, you know, leaders aren't all the same. Political leaders aren't all the same. Stating the obvious, but navigating the correlation between wealth and carbon emissions is very difficult, because if you're in a leadership position, you're more likely to be high wealth, higher status, and that correlates very closely with emissions, and therefore the accusations of hypocrisy that can be leveled at you if you try to do the right thing um, are well, it's going to happen, and we see that in the media all the time. So if somebody kind of raises their head and says, "I'm doing this for the sake of the environment," then they are very likely in the media to be criticized for any area where there may be any inconsistency between what they say and say their carbon footprint. So an example of this, which came up quite a lot in my research, was Prince Harry in the UK and Meghan Markle. They made a statement a few years ago that they were going to have 2 children maximum because of environmental reasons. In other words, they weren't going to have a bigger family because of environmental reasons. And they were pounced on by the media because for being hypocrites in effect, because and for other reasons really. The media was out to get them, but they were pounced on the media for being hypocrites because they fly in private jets. And this came up in the interviews that I did with MPs, and it was interesting because some of the politicians said, "Oh, this proves that you can't win. You do something good, and you'll always be criticised for something else." And there may be some truth in that, but it also seems to suggest that flying in private jets, for instance, is unavoidable and therefore beyond criticism. And so I think it's really hard for leaders to navigate this, though. I think they're correct that any attempts they do make to be behavioral leaders in this space will inevitably be open to criticism and accusations of hypocrisy. But in my paper, I do make a few recommendations based on the studies that I did for my PhD, and perhaps I'll just rattle through those recommendations. So, and these recommendations are to be tested in terms of how well they work for leaders. But the idea is that they may alleviate some of these criticisms and some of these accusations of hypocrisy, and preempt those accusations. So the first recommendation is be clear that behavior change is only part of the solution. So don't suggest that behavior change is the whole picture. The second is take on behaviors that substantially reduce your total carbon footprint so that they can't be dismissed as token gestures. So, for instance, if a leader said, "Oh, I'm going to eat more plant-based food. I'm going to cut down on meat," but they're still flying in private jets quite often or at all, that behavior is just going to be likely to be dismissed as a token gesture, and people are very aware of token gestures. Also communicate the carbon savings of the changes, because not everybody knows, and this is another factor, that another thing that behavior from leaders can actually communicate what is important and what's not important. So if leaders communicate, they say, "I'm making this change and this is how much it is going to cut from my carbon footprint," and that communicating that difference is really important. And consistency over time. So the fourth recommendation is consistency over time, to avoid this idea that you are just making a token gesture and virtue signaling. So it needs to be a change that you can continue. And the last recommendation we make is that it's important to acknowledge everybody's situational and temporal realities, or rather, in plain speak, just everybody is in a different position and can't make the changes at the same time. So, there's a lot of low carbon choices that people just don't have the option of making. So public transport, for instance, if it's not available, you can't do it. Or flights being so much more cheap than plane travel. For a lot of people, you say, "Well, I've got a time penalty, but also a financial penalty if I take the train." So it's really important to acknowledge those realities whilst advocating for change. But yeah, it's really not simple, and it requires deep systemic change as well as leadership in a behavioural sense.
Steve, can I ask, if you don't mind me asking, what was your PhD on, and what was your undergrad and masters, if you got them? Just curious.
Sure. So my undergrad was computer science. That was some time ago. My master's was in climate change management, it was called. That was at Birkbeck. So that was climate science, economics of climate change, policy, and then I did some anthropology. That was the master's. And then my PhD was in psychology, so environmental psychology. So it was at the psychology department in Cardiff University.
Thanks.
Yes, so what do you think are the areas of research would be are the most critical to explore next in understanding the relationship between leadership and climate action? I think you mentioned some of them a while ago because you had recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my research personally, I think the most important thing is to do the research in other countries and to understand whether this effect could happen more broadly than the UK. I think that I take a top-down and bottom-up approach. So it's the relationship between leaders and followers, for want of a better term. So the public, what the public wants, and how leaders act is a constant relationship, and they feed into each other. So, for instance, understanding that the public, say there was evidence that globally there's an appetite for leadership. People want leaders to lead by example. Providing that evidence may embolden some leaders to change, and that has a feedback relationship with people, as evidenced by my research. So people see leaders acting, and it sends strong signals about what those leaders really believe and how committed they are, how serious they are. So it's personally, I think more top down and bottom up um, research on leaders and how they can change their behavior and how effective that will be. And so there's research programs that are being designed now to engage with leaders, business leaders, celebrities, politicians, to help them navigate this particular area and show them what the effects might be.
Yes, so I just have an anecdote. This is not about climate change or the environment, but this is real life anyway. But I just want to give an example. If you know politicians or high value people like cannot avoid to do travel in a public, plane. So I just want to say that the chairman of the Philippine Airlines, the owner of the Philippine Airlines, he would use the third class, not business class, not the first class, but just the regular class to travel in to other countries. Well, he was not thinking about climate change, but for the reason that he wanted to understand what is the service of their airline for these people who are just traveling economy. And yeah, he does that. And I also know Taipan, a billionaire, who is not trying to use this, luxury items, and basically does not ask for um, a royal treatment when they travel. Instead, they are just like very ordinary. So, if it's quite difficult, maybe for celebrities or high value individuals to do that, maybe there are some, but there are individuals who have such kind of attitude who would like to be very simple, and yet a lot of people do respect them because the kind of humility or the kind of discipline maybe that they have for their behavior. I just want to mention this. So such kinds of people exist.
Yeah, thanks, Cecile. I think that's a really good point, and it taps into what might be fairly fundamental values or cultural values about not being wasteful or not being greedy or profligate. And these I guess these values are always in contention and politically part of the discussion. And so, but I think they are accessible. And so, as you say, there are a lot of people who respect that kind of behavior. Um, and so it's not a lost cause in terms of hoping or expecting leaders to embody those kind of values. And as I think as if climate breakdown or the environmental crises continue to manifest, there may be a kind of realignment of those values. But also, there's a great deal of resistance to them, and our economic system at the moment, as I mentioned earlier, is obviously pretty dependent on and based on increasing consumption and growth in a GDP sense, as opposed to other forms of growth. And so for yeah, it's a big challenge. But I thank you for the reference to the owner of the Philippine Airlines. That's somebody else I will look up as well as a possible exemplar.
Yeah, I think it's also in the way that people are conditioned on how to have a certain kind of attitude. I have another anecdote. My cousin, she is a countess in Switzerland, and when she visits me, she's just very simple. Although she designs for these luxury brands and rub shoulders with Bono and Richard Gere and other celebrities, she's very very simple. And one day, their maid in Switzerland called me oh, your cousin is going there, but look at her bags, her luggage, she does not prepare. And when her maid tries to visit me, she's bringing me luxury items. So just imagine the kind of contrast and attitude that you have, because I noticed that there are a lot of celebrities also that are in fact very simple. Actually, they're not really particular about the brands that they're wearing. I think I know many people who are doing that. And yeah, I also know the former president of China Bank, and I saw him one weekend, and I would think that, he's one of our janitors who is walking, because he was very, very simple actually, in very simple clothes, and you would not even understand that, he is as rich as that and has the status as that. So I think there is a lot of misinterpretation among the crowd also, for people who would like to be flashy, because those people who are used to being kind of old rich maybe, or they are so bored about having attention, are very low profile people. But does social media, or do a lot of people know about these kinds of behavior? Maybe not, because maybe a few of us only know. But yeah, these are stories in real life that I'm telling you about. So I would just like to say that such kinds of situation exist. Probably, if I remember more, I have other examples, because those who are really high up there are not as flashy maybe as those who just become like rich, or would like to have an attention suddenly. So yeah, there are such lifestyles.
And it
Uh,
was a
uh, uh,
Singaporean PM, not the Korean PM. Sorry, uh, but I
Thanks,
corrected
Mark.
myself.
Thanks for the correction.
I have another question I thought of. I'm kind of interested in too. I guess I'm starting to grow more interested. And do you think this may have implications for follow the leader, stuff like that, for behavior, domains like public health, and social learning theory? Do you think there's a correlation there? Maybe.
I mean, yes, social learning theory is one of the theories that I've called on early in my research. Yeah, I think so. I can't speak to that in any great detail. Um, and in terms of public health, I mean, uh, there is a lot of research, as I'm sure you're aware, in terms of the influence of um, others on one's health-related behavior, be it smoking or diet, etc. So yeah, I think it's highly applicable for sure.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Yeah, I think Steve, we have many questions and some issues also. Like, for example, even in the American setting, which is happening now, because basically the one who will be assigned to work on public health is somebody who is an anti-vaxxer. And yeah, so it's a big issue, because the leaders believe in a certain kind of policy, and we know that it will greatly influence. A lot of people are protesting about it, but you see, even during the time of COVID, there are a lot of anti-vaxxers also, whose belief are just there without any scientific support, and they belong to certain sects. They belong to certain groups of people that are there, subcultures maybe. So I think, yeah, a leader's attitude and how um, the officers of the government are organized around that is really very important. So we even look at it in terms of, for example, the wars that are happening, and yeah, it's very important also. So there's so much, I think, to research. But as regards climate change, focusing on that, I think, people need to have someone like you to do further research, because we need to advocate for an action call.
Oh, thank you very much, Cecile. Yeah, I appreciate that. And yeah, you mentioned COVID. I think that was an interesting example of this idea of embodiment. For instance, when leaders were wearing face masks or not wearing face masks, and that became quite a powerful marker of, um, well, it's an embodied response to a threat that signaled a commitment to the scale of the threat and also the possible solution. So it's that kind of embodiment that I think is similar, not identical, but similar with climate change, and the signals sent by an embodied response can be really powerful, even if it is symbolic. Yeah, but yeah, I appreciate your comments about the research. Thanks, Cecile.
Yeah, thank you. So, there is so much to talk about. And yeah, we hope to hear more from you. But we are near the top of the hour. So, Steve, if you have other researches, we would like to invite you back again here in Quantum Photonics. You see, here in Clubhouse, I think there's a very strong group about sustainability. And actually, I haven't been active last year, but 2 years ago, we had been doing a lot of COP rooms, discussing in detail about what's happening and what can be done. And I also founded another club here called the European Union Club, which is not active now because I'm very busy, but I used to have a weekly forum inviting researchers, serious researchers like you, to talk about climate change and how to try to do our advocacy on it, and how can people, even in their own small way, try to help mitigate the situation. So thank you so much. We've learned so much from you, and I'd like to give you back the mic if you have some final words before we close the room.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cecile. It's been a real pleasure, and I appreciate the engagement and the yeah, just the dialogue we've had, and the kind of serious consideration of the issues. Just a final comment which I haven't made. I think I vaguely touched on it at the beginning. Was there are some quite important justice issues related to this topic, in terms of, for instance, talking about, say, flying less can be difficult and problematic in terms of, say, access to fora, for particularly for people in the global south. It can be quite um, it has potential negative justice implications, and so I think it needs to be discussed very carefully, and certainly that's something I need to pay attention to as I continue this research. There may indeed also be gender elements to gender considerations in terms of justice, um, how people's actions are considered in a gendered way. So, I just want to um, confirm that I try not to have a sort of simplistic view of this, and it's a research topic that I take quite seriously, and hopefully come to with some level of sensitivity. But yeah, thank you very much for the engagement and the invitation to speak with you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Steve. So I'd like to ask Bob if he has some final comment also before we close the room.
Thank you, Cecile. And actually, I wanted to say thank you on behalf of everyone in the audience that wasn't able to ask a question, but we hope to hear from you again. Thank you, sir.
Yeah,
Thanks
let's
very much.
flash our mics for Steve, our great speaker. So thank you, Steve. It's just like we are giving you a standing ovation.
Thank you very much. I'm
Yeah.
touched. I am. You can have a
Thank you.
standing
And
ovation back. Thank you.
in Clubhouse. So I'd like to pass the mic to Darcel. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Kevin, Satcha, and Ash for coming up the stage. Thank you, everyone in the audience. I cannot mention all your names, but thank you for supporting the room. See you in the next rooms, and I'd like to give you the mic now, Darcel, to help us do the countdown.
Thank you, Cecile, and thank you, Doctor, for a great talk. To close the room, we're going to start our countdown from lucky number 8. Is everybody ready?
Ready.
Ready?
We,
8.
we,
Ocho.
Ash, 7. No Ash.
Seven.
7.
Oh, no Sasha either.
7.
Kevin,
Sorry.
6.
Sixer.
Okay. Mark is
Sixer,
on the
yeah.
phone. So no Mark. Okay. I'll be 4. 4. Bob Thrice.
3 for me.
Cecile Dos Agnes.
Dos Equis.
Good doctor, your numero uno. Call out the last number, please.
Uno.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Steve. See you again next time and
Yeah.
see you in the next rooms, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.